Is there anything better than a really great villain? Now, Disney Animation Studios has created some of the most memorable and iconic villains in history. I mean, the Disney villains are in many ways as recognizable and beloved in a way as, the Disney princesses or heroes of their stories and movies. So in this video, I will be providing you with my tier list of every major villain from a Disney animated movie, ranked according to 4 primary categories that I have defined as the major ways of determining how effective that antagonist is in fulfilling the role they're meant to fulfill within their story. So yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun and probably a fair bit controversial, so please definitely let me know in the comments what you think. Do you think I'm right? Do you think I'm crazy? Do you have a completely different take than I do on a ranking for one of the characters that we put down? I'd love to hear from you and we get a good conversation going, because it's always a lot of fun to talk to other fellow story nerds about this kind of thing. So real quick before we dive into the actual tier list, I need to do a tiny bit of framing to explain how I am ranking and categorizing each of these characters, just so we're all on the same page. So the first thing to emphasize is that I am ranking the characters themselves, not the movie they are from. If you've been hanging out here in the Story Castle with me for a while, you probably already know or have watched perhaps the 2-part complete breakdown tier list of every Disney animated movie as a whole, and I will put the link in the description to those 2 videos if you want to go and watch those after you finish this one. But in this video, we are going to be focusing specifically on just the antagonist characters, so you may see a specific character get a lower or higher ranking than the movie they actually featured in, depending on how effective they are just as a character in and of themselves. The second is that I am only drawing from movies that have a clear and defined antagonist, which means I'm not necessarily going to talk about every single animated Disney movie, because some of them don't have a clear antagonist. Like Bambi, for example, does not have a primary antagonist in that story, so I'm not talking about it because I don't want to waste your time. You'll also notice that I keep using the word antagonist instead of villain, even though Disney villain is kind of the iconic term. And that's because increasingly, especially as we get into more modern Disney, we're going to find that some characters might actually surprise you. And there's a couple later on in the list that I think are really going to surprise you that I'm putting on this list, because they don't seem like villains or bad guys, but they do serve the primary antagonistic role, as in the character function that provides the force of opposition that requires the protagonist, or the primary character, to grow, adapt, evolve in order to overcome the challenge that the antagonist primarily represents or provides as they oppose them. So there may be some surprising inclusions on this list that you can look forward to. Finally, let's take a look at the 4 categories that I'm using to rank and score each of these characters in order to come up with a little bit more of a concrete tier rating system versus an entirely subjective one. Of course, every tier list is entirely subjective at one level, because these are just my opinions, but I did try to make it a little bit more clear how I was assigning them into their various broad tier ranking brackets. So the 4 categories are motive, power, impact, and style. A good antagonist needs to have a clear and defining motive, a reason for doing what they're doing that is compelling and interesting and makes sense. Not necessarily that we agree with, because very often, by definition, the antagonist's motive is one we don't want to have happen. We don't want them to succeed, but we do need, as the audience, to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. Power refers to the antagonist's sort of power or capability, or how strong or dangerous they are within the story. Worth noting that we are defining power within the context of the story they appear in, not relative to each other. So, if you have one character that's like an all-powerful sorcerer, and you have another character that's a conniving politician, they might actually be comparatively similarly powerful in the sense that they represent like an equally high gap between what the protagonist is capable of at the beginning of the story and their ability to influence the world of the story in various ways and try to fulfill their motive or their agenda. Impact refers to how impactful or necessary or significant the antagonist's actions and choices as a character are to the overall story. And finally, style is a very important category, which is kind of a catch-all category that has to do with how memorable or distinct or interesting is the antagonist as a character? Do they have a lot of personality dynamics, or sometimes behavioral tics, or patterns of dialogue, or visual style, different things that really set them apart and make them intensely memorable and unique, or are they a little bit more bland and generic? So I will be assigning every character that we review in this video a score from 1 to 10 in each of those categories, which means the lowest possible score a character could get would be 4, and the highest would be 40, with the one caveat that I have also included a bonus category of a bonus 5 points for any antagonist that does a really good job of representing the counter theme in the movie. I'll talk more specifically about what that looks like when we get to those cases, and why I think that's a strong argument to be made that the antagonist represents the counter theme. But when that happens, it does a lot to make that character better and stronger, and contributes a lot to the impact of the story they're in. So in those cases, those characters will get an additional 5-point bonus. And then the specific ranking of the character into the tiers from S down to D will be determined by their total score in relation to the other character. Okay, so with all that foundation in place, welcome to the Story Castle, a home for story nerds everywhere. I am Justin Fike, and let's do this. All right, kicking it off with the OG villain, the original first villain from the first animated Disney movie, Snow White, the Wicked Queen. It's never a great sign when your character's name is just Wicked Blank, rather than having a name. I did discover when I was researching, apparently her name is Queen Grimhild, but even that is a bit up for debate. The Wicked Queen has some flaws as an antagonist, for sure, but in a lot of ways, her flaws as a character are related to flaws that the movie itself, or I should say the story of the movie, has. The point of creating that movie was heavily leaning towards showing off the incredible animation. The art of the movie was a lot of its reason for existing, and they just sort of took an existing fairy tale that people were familiar with, and many old fairy tales don't really put a lot of weight on strong characterization and so on. So the Wicked Queen really doesn't have a motive. I mean, you could sort of vaguely say it's like jealousy or vanity, but it's never really explained why she cares so much about being the fairest in the land, or what would happen if she wasn't it's just very, very, very weak as a motive. Her power is there. She is certainly the change agent in the story, but that's partly because Snow White is a shockingly passive protagonist who doesn't want anything other than kind of to survive-ish, but even that is super vague. And I would call her style very generic and uninteresting if it wasn't for the fact that she kind of originated the archetype, so it's not entirely fair to say that it's cliche, because you can't be cliche if you're the first one that did a thing. You know, brooding, powerful sorceress lady is sort of her vibe, and she does it well enough. So I gave her a 1 for motive, a 7 for power, a 9 for impact, a 5 for style. The movie doesn't really have a clear theme, so she doesn't represent any counter theme enough to be worth bonus points, which brings her total score to a 22, which, yeah, she's a bit meh. So I think, yeah, this ranking system looks like it's working quite nicely. Moving to our next Wicked Blank character, the Wicked Stepmother, this time from Cinderella. Again, I think her name is Lady Tremaine, but again, you'd have to dig real hard to find that. The Wicked Stepmother is at least a little bit more human and fleshed out of a character, partly because she gets more screen time, and partly because a little bit more energy is spent in Cinderella on telling the story and having the characters exist as characters, rather than just as fantastically animated things on a screen. There is at least a bit of nuance to her motive. You could kind of make the argument that it's some version of like weird or misplaced motherly love. Like there's this implication that because her daughters are homely and boorish and whatever, and Cinderella's so amazing, she just has to put Cinderella down all the time in order for her daughters to have room to shine, I guess. But you have to dig really hard. That is certainly not explicitly stated or explored. It's implied. Her power and her impact are also a bit more muted than the Wicked Queen. Not because she doesn't do magic, because again, it doesn't really matter whether she can do magic. The question is, how powerful is she within the context of the story? And she certainly is at one level
But a lot of her power is derived from the fact that Cinderella is incredibly passive and sort of just goes along with it. She sort of gives her power by listening to her and doing whatever she says and not really wanting anything or trying to do anything on her own. Cinderella doesn't even really get a motive or a desire, like to go to the ball, until past the halfway mark. And then when she does get that motive, she doesn't do anything about it. Now, again, this is not a space to rant about some of the flaws in the storytelling in Cinderella, but it means that the antagonist doesn't have a lot to work with, because her goal, essentially, her motive is to like maintain the status quo. And that can work. Like, you could kind of argue that President Snow from the Hunger Games, for example, is an antagonist whose motive is to maintain the status quo. But in that case, the stakes of the status quo are much higher. If he succeeds, people's lives are ruined / people die. The stakes are high. If the Wicked Stepmother succeeds, Cinderella has to keep cleaning the floors. Like, it sucks, but it's really not that big of a deal, especially because it's not like Cinderella has this burning desire to do anything different. So when the stakes are low, having the antagonist not wanting anything or trying to do anything, it just creates a very slow, kind of circular story narrative thread. So I gave her a 2 for motive, a 6 for power, a 5 for impact, a 6 for style, bringing her total score to a 19 at the very, very bottom of our C category. Next up, we have Captain Hook. This one surprised me. I came into this thinking, oh, okay, now we're going to finally break out of C and get a better antagonist. And then as I started thinking about it, I realized that, narratively speaking, as an antagonist character in the story, Captain Hook has a lot of flaws and shortcomings. Now, let me start by saying I think what redeems him as a character is that his style is over-the-top iconic. And that's why you see him walking around the Disney parks and you can go get his autograph, because he's memorable. And that's a good illustration of how significant a role a strong style for a character can play. But if you think about the narrative of Peter Pan, there's really 2 main problems. One is, again, we get back to this issue of motive and agency. He doesn't really want anything. When they created the live-action adaptation, the Hook, with Robin Williams and Dustin Hoffman, which is an amazing movie, part of what makes that movie amazing is they gave Hook a motive, and he is the inciting incident of the story, because he actually comes to the real world and kidnaps Peter Pan's kids. That is not the case in this one. He has nothing to do with the kids coming to Neverland, and he doesn't really have anything to do with stopping them from leaving. The central story question is sort of, will the kids decide to stay in Neverland and be kids forever, or will they decide to go home, go back to the real world, and kind of take their place as early adolescents? And Hook really doesn't have anything to do with any of that, because he doesn't really want anything. He wants revenge on Peter Pan in a very generic way, but until later, much later in the story, he's not even really trying to do much about that. Also, he is at a dramatic power imbalance to the protagonist, and that is generally not good. Peter Pan can fly. He has magic. He actually knows Neverland much better than Hook. Hook is the outsider. Peter Pan is the native. It's a little bit hard to create tension in a scene if you know that your protagonist could just fly 10 feet in the air at any point, and then the antagonist literally cannot do anything to him. The only way they created tension in the climax was by Peter Pan kind of coming up with this contrived way where, because of his ego, he agrees to not fly in their fight. But it is not great if you have to go to such kind of contorted lengths to make a real climax happen. It's an inherent flaw in sort of the power or threat level of the antagonist, because it doesn't require anything from the protagonist to try to like rise to that level. So I gave Hook a 2 for motive, a 4 for power, a 2 for impact, and a 10 for style. That 10 definitely saved him, but I'm going to put him down here, and maybe the word forgettable is not exactly the right word for this tier, because obviously his style makes him very memorable, as we already talked about, but I think I explained from a narrative standpoint, purely within his role as a character in the story, what some of his shortcomings are as an antagonist character. Next up, we have Maleficent from Sleeping Beauty, sort of Wicked Sorceress 2.0, but at least she has a name. Maleficent is a good example of that power imbalance that I was just talking about with Captain Hook, flipped the other direction. The fact that she not only works magic, but works the strongest magic. I mean, she puts the entire kingdom to sleep, and then when her spell is threatened, eventually she turns into a dragon, and she is the final boss. So her power level, like her role within the story and the significance that that plays, has a lot to do with forcing mainly Prince Philip, because again, There's problems with Aurora as a protagonist. It's not exactly her fault. She's asleep for most of the movie. It's hard to be an interesting protagonist when you can't do anything. And so the protagonist role is split between her and Prince Philip. But in any case, they have to deal with her, and the fact that that is a difficult thing to do forces them to try harder and do more, etc. So her power scale is high, her impact is high, like she drives the story forward. Motive, again, is weak, and we really have not, so far in Disney storytelling, they have not figured out how to develop an antagonist with interesting motive and drive that is compelling or understandable. It's sort of vaguely, again, jealousy or a sense of pique, like she wasn't invited to the christening, and so she is going to go nuclear on everybody and way overreact, and oh wow, like she's offended and she's evil. Not great from a motive standpoint. So I gave Maleficent a 3 for motive, a 10 for power, a 7 for impact, and an 8 for style. I think they did a good job of taking the kind of original, generically evil, brooding queen sorceress thing and turning it up to 11 and making it more distinctive and more memorable. For a total score of 28, bringing her right here into the good enough category. And yeah, I think Sleeping Beauty as a movie, as a story, is made dramatically better by Maleficent as the antagonist character. And if she did a less effective job of some of those categories, the movie would be worse than it is. Bringing us to Cruella de Vil. Okay, this is a fun one for me to talk about. Here we finally have an antagonist that does, I think, a much better job, I guess spoilers, does a much better job of some of these things that we have been talking about, so let's break it down. We finally get a character with a discernible motive. It's not the best. We will find antagonist characters later on who have much clearer or better or more interesting motives, but at least we understand what she wants and why she wants it. She is obsessed with herself. She is, obsessed with fashion, according to at least how she sees it. She must have a fur coat. She loves furs. She lives for furs. And she has decided she will have a Dalmatian fur coat, and it's going to come from these puppies. Okay, that is a motive that makes sense. And it's a motive that drives the story, because now all of a sudden having an antagonist who wants something creates story problems and story agency, and the whole story revolves around, will she get what she wants or not? That's good motivation in an antagonist and a better example of what that can do for a story. She also has huge impact. She's the inciting incident, because first she tries to buy the dogs, then she sends her henchmen to kidnap the dogs, and not just at the beginning though, all the way along in the story, at each point when the story energy starts to lag a bit, like towards the middle, okay, she calls the henchman and says, hey, go kill all the dogs now. Like, that's her thing. She does that. And then when the puppies actually escape and you would think, oh, they've been saved, all the tension is dropping. Well, she gets in her car and goes to find them herself. Like, she has good narrative agency. Even though she has henchmen she's ordering around, it's her doing it as a character at multiple significant points in the story. So yes, a much better example now of an antagonist with significant means. Like, she's extremely wealthy, and so she has some of the opportunities that wealth affords someone in society, and she can use those things to go after what she wants, and she does it consistently, which creates a lot of threat and drama and stakes in the story and makes it better, which is what a good antagonist should do. Also, she's our first character to get the thematic bonus points. The central theme of 101 Dalmatians doesn't exactly hit you over the head, but I would argue it's something in the vein of family is the most important thing in the world. And they explore that through both the human characters and especially through the Dalmatian characters, the lengths that Pongo and Perdita go for their kids. That's a really strong central theme, and Cruella represents a strong counter-argument to that, which is that I am the most important thing in the world. She doesn't value anything or anyone outside of herself. She's sort of the embodiment of selfishness rather than the selflessness, especially of the animal characters. And that sets up, again, a strong thematic tension. So I'm going to give her the bonus points. And since I have awarded her a 6 for motive, a 7 for power, a 10 for impact, and a 10 for style, I mean, how could you give her anything less than a 10 for style? She's sort of psychotic scarecrow Audrey Hepburn. Whoever came up with that was on some kind of bender, and I love it. Which gives her a total of 33 plus 5 for the bonus points, a 38, bringing her in as our first S-tier iconic villain, which I think is completely appropriate. I mean, she makes that story work. But from the lofty heights of Cruella de Vil, we need to come back down to talk about Shere Khan. from Jungle Book. Shere Khan is the first good example of a trend that we will see a few other times in this and also in some other stories of what I would just call an off-screen threat, an off-screen antagonist. They represent a threat, but they are not particularly actively involved in most of the scenes of the movie, so it's more the implication that they're out there somewhere. And that's really just not as strong as having an antagonist who's actively involved in the story and making choices and doing things that move the narrative along. We also land back in the territory of weak or vague motive. He's a tiger. He wants to hunt Mowgli because he's heard that Mowgli is a different kind of prey. So I guess, boredom? Hard to define, not particularly interesting, certainly not very compelling. And like I said, most of the story, the narrative tension and the key question of the story isn't, will Mowgli be able to survive and escape Shere Khan's wrath? It's, will Mowgli choose to accept his fate of going back to the human world, or will he find a way to stay in the jungle? And Shere Khan really doesn't have too much to do with that other than sort of representing the fact that I guess the jungle is a bit of a dangerous place. I will say it's interesting that they gave him this sort of posh, upper crust British personality. That was an interesting choice, and it does a little bit to help him stand out versus, I guess, what he might otherwise have been. But overall, not a particularly interesting or impactful antagonist. I gave him a 2 for motive, a 6 for power, a 1 for impact, and a 6 for style, bringing him to a not particularly impressive 15. Which brings us to Edgar from the Aristocats. When I did my Disney tier list video of movies in general, I kept saying aristocrats, because that's the actual word. I'm not going to do that this time. It is the Aristocats. Edgar, certainly not the most iconic Disney villain in history, but I do think a great example of the impact that a really good antagonist motive can have. Edgar spent his whole life serving as the butler of a very posh, well-to-do, rich, aristocratic French woman, and I suppose expected to get something for that in his old age, to be taken care of, and then he overhears her on a phone call talking to her lawyer saying she's going to leave all of her wealth and fortune to her cats because she's a crazy cat lady and has no family. And he is maybe justifiably upset about that. A good antagonist motive is one that starts from a point where we look at that and we as the audience or the readers can go, oh, wait a minute, that would bother me too, or I understand that. That makes sense. You're justified in feeling that way, or that's like a legitimate problem or situation or issue. And then what makes them an antagonist is what they actually go and do about it. And then we're like, whoa, maybe that was a little too far. Like, maybe don't put all the cats in a sack and try and go drown them in a river. That's kind of, ugh. But the starting point of motive is more solid, and again, as a great illustration of like motive leads to action and agency. Because he has that motive, then he goes and does a thing. However, problems with Edgar are that as soon as he does that, he kind of falls into that Shere Khan trap of like, now he's this off-screen threat, and he's not even a threat. Like, the challenge then is can the cats get home again? He doesn't even know that they're still alive. He doesn't know they're trying to get back home, and he's not really trying to stop them until much later in the movie, so he doesn't really have much role to play in the story for a good part of it. Also, one thing worth talking about with Edgar is how difficult it is to create a buffoonish or comedic antagonist. We're meant to laugh at Edgar frequently. Like, he is kind of a clown. And that can work if you're very careful about how you do it, but then you're requiring this character to sort of fulfill two roles, both comedic relief and the antagonist role. And the antagonist role is more important in the story, and generally speaking, the more comedic you make him, the less threatening he is, which undermines the stakes and tension of the story for the sake of a few cheap laughs of him getting bit in the butt by a dog. So that's not great. So I gave Edgar a 9 for motive, a 2 for power, a 6 for impact, and a 4 for style, leaving him with a 21, kind of down here on the lower end of meh. Which brings us to Prince John. Actually, I'm so happy that these two came next to each other because Prince John is a much better example of an essentially comedic antagonist, but done well. He is silly, we do laugh at him, but they place the emphasis more squarely on the fact that he is the antagonist of the story, not so much that he is a clown. And they don't allow his sort of comedic aspect of his character to ever fully undercut the threat that he poses, or the challenge that he poses in the story. They do a solid job developing some motivation for him. Sibling rivalry, sibling jealousy. Oh, mother always loved Richard best. And he feels overlooked and, is trying to show that he is also great and wonderful and cool and everything else. Power's quite high, he has the sheriff and a whole army of whatever, and he's the king, and he's in charge of stuff, and he can do a lot when he tries to do things, and he tries to do things. Like, he does, he arranges the archery tournament to capture Robin Hood, and he goes and sends the sheriff out to go imprison the whole town. Like, he does stuff in the story. And also, I think style, again, it's helpful to remember that just because something is done a certain way doesn't mean it had to be done that way. You could have had Prince John as a more normal character. I think they did such a great job using the fact that his crown barely fits him and he's wearing these big baggy pajama style robes to kind of illustrate that thing of he's this smaller character who's trying so hard to fill this shoes that his big brother, leaves behind or whatever, and to be more, struggling to keep up and be awesome and be a king, even though he can't really quite pull it off. All of that is done not, subtextually through a lot of his character style, which I think is pretty cool and very well done. So I gave Prince John a 7 for motive, an 8 for power, a 9 for impact, and an 8 for style, bringing him up to a solid 32, right here in the A great category, which I think is a great spot for him to be. Next, we have Medusa from The Rescuers. She is kind of like a budget Cruella to me. She does a lot of the same things as a character, but she does them worse. Main thing that I really have a problem with for her as a character is her motive. She has a clear one. At one level, she wants to get that, get the diamond, and she knows that it's in this cave. But the problem is that there are massive logical gaps in the decision-making chain that she goes through that leads to the main function of making her the antagonist, which is kidnapping Penny the orphan. She kidnaps her because she is so small, she's the only kid she can find who's small enough to fit through this hole. But that is a torturously weak decision-making process for the character. You're sitting there wait a minute, get dynamite, get a sledgehammer, go find another way and drill it. There's so many other less illegal or less problematic ways of solving that problem and going and getting what she wants. Also, there's not a whole lot of stakes involved. At one level, who cares if she gets the diamond? Yeah, she's kind of a nasty lady, but so what? When your answer to the question of what happens if the antagonist succeeds is sort of not much. Who really cares? Especially yes, I mean, she kidnaps Penny, but it's not like she's gonna kill her afterwards. If she gets the diamond, she'll let her go. So just let her get the diamond and let her go. The stakes are weak. The logic behind kidnapping this kid to make her do this thing, it's just weak. And so that just creates an inherent flaw in the storytelling of the movie. So I gave Medusa a 4 for motive, a 3 for power, a 7 for impact, and a 2 for style, bringing her down to a 16 in our D tier. And speaking of D tier, we have this character. Bonus points to anyone who can tell me who this is without looking it up. Yes, this is the Horned King from the Black Cauldron. If Medusa is budget Cruella, then wow, is the Horned King budget Sauron. And not even a very interesting one. Yes, he has high power in the story and even impact in the story because, I mean, he's this crazy, powerful and end-of-the-world necromancer guy, I guess, but just zero motive whatsoever. He is evil overlord. He is conquer all. He is death. Maw. Blech. And style, creepy skeleton sorcerer guy, is just a very bland and generic villain across the board. I gave him a 2 for motive, an 8 for power, a 4 for impact because he has that same kind of Shere Khan thing of yes, he's super scary, but he's almost entirely off screen, sending minions and sort of being a threat, but also not, and you sort of forget that he exists for a while until he pops back up again. And a 1 for style, which honestly maybe even could have been a 0, bringing him a total of 15. But that brings us to Professor Rattigan from The Great Mouse Detective, a movie that is very near and dear to my heart, and Professor Rattigan is one of the big reasons for that. He is a great antagonist and a great character. He kind of has a similar motivation type to Prince John. At its core, he is a rat, and he's tired of everyone calling him that and talking down to him because he's actually very smart and capable, and he would like to be seen for the wonderful person that he is. But because he never received that, now he's turned evil, and he has this plan to, take over England and become king, and everyone will respect him then. It's interesting. Like, again, certainly not, wow, I would do those things, but it's that there's that undercurrent of like, oh yeah, that kind of sucks, and maybe even I can resonate with that. Maybe a lot of us have had similar experiences where we feel like people misjudge us or mistreat us because of external things that are beyond our control, like compelling motive. Very importantly, because this is essentially a detective story, it's really important that the detective be adequately challenged, and Rattigan does a phenomenal job of that. He is hyper smart, and at many points in the story, he outsmarts Basil. He captures him, he traps him. His plan is actually pretty darn effective, and you need the antagonist of that kind of story to have it be clear that they would succeed if it was not for the intervention of the intrepid detective. And he very much is that way. Like, his plan works. The robot queen actually succeeds at one point. He becomes the regent. He gets in that scene where, like, he got what he wanted. Like, he had succeeded. He has his army of henchmen and a giant cat and all of these things. And so it requires Basil and Watson to do so much more. And literally, this is one of the first times that we see how the power level and effectiveness of the antagonist character literally forces the protagonist to grow and change. We're getting into more effective storytelling here. Basil is different at the end of the story than he was at the beginning, and in large part, that difference, it comes as a result of the ways that he is forced to grow or learn a lesson or become different in response to the threats and challenges posed by Rattigan. That is great, effective, not just storytelling, but specifically antagonist role in the story. So I gave Rattigan a 6 for motive, a 9 for power, a 10 for impact, and a 10 for style, bringing him up to a very respectable 35. There's not a strong enough central theme, I think, in The Great Mouse Detective to show that he is the opposite of it, but he nonetheless, on his own as a character, still gets a really good score. Next, we have Ursula from The Little Mermaid. I think that my ranking of The Little Mermaid and my opinions about it as a story were probably the most contentious part of my overall Disney movie tier list. I stand by those opinions, but I also understand people's points of view who really like the story, and I do think that Ursula is one of the better elements of the story as an antagonist, despite the fact that she really doesn't have a good, clear motive. There are different variations of the Little Mermaid story that give her one, but that specific version doesn't really have it. She's kind of doing her own thing, and Ariel goes to her, and Ariel's like, hey, I want this thing, and Ursula's like, okay, and then increasingly she kind of gets more involved in trying to sort of to keep Ariel's voice that she got in the bargain, but it's not like she went to her or anything. Like, she doesn't really have a particularly clear motive as a character, but certainly good, strong power. The main problem that she has as a character, I wouldn't even say is necessarily her fault. It kind of comes down to the format of the story. Once Ariel gets the transformation from her that she wanted, Ursula is sort of off screen for a chunk. But thankfully, it would have been easy and her score would have been a lot lower if that had stayed true until the climax of the story. But when it starts to seem like Ariel's going to succeed, Ursula takes action. She transforms herself into a person and she goes and gets involved. And so at least because she has a little bit more agency in the story, she's not as off-screen for as long as some of the other sort of off-screen threat type characters are. So overall, I think she plays a very effective antagonist role and definitely elevates the story more than if she had been absent or a different type of character. So I gave Ursula a 4 for motive, an 8 for power, a 6 for impact, an 8 for style, bringing her up to a total of 26. Again, I don't really feel like there's a strong enough central theme in The Little Mermaid to give her any bonus points, but even without that, that lands her solidly in the good enough tier, which I think works out well. Next, we have Percival McLeach from the second Rescuers movie, Rescuers Down Under. And the fact that this is our first sequel antagonist gives us a chance to sort of talk about whether they improved on the role from the first one. And yes, I definitely think he did. At least he has not just a clear motive, they both have the same motive, greed. But his motive, it does two things much, much better. One is stakes. Whereas before, it's like, well, so what if she gets the diamond? In this case, if he gets what he wants, he kills the last great golden eagle. Like, that's stakes that matters. It matters to our protagonist, and it can matter to us. So we want him to be stopped. It matters that he's stopped, which is much better motivation for an antagonist. Also, it makes total sense. There's a logical reason why he kidnaps Cody, and therefore now the rescuers do need to save him. He kidnaps him because he sees the feather in his backpack and realizes that Cody knows where her nest is, and so he kidnaps him to go find it and, like, get what he wanted. So in both cases, same basic setup, but this one is just executed much, much better. So I gave McLeach a 7 for motive, a 6 for power, a 9 for impact, a 6 for style, no bonus points, for a total of 28, which puts him, again, right in this range. Next up, we have quite a few compelling antagonists in a row to talk about from what many people would argue was Disney's golden age of movies, and I think it's interesting that in their golden age of movies, it's also sort of their golden age of antagonists, and I don't think that is an accident. So let's break this down, starting with Gaston.
Real quick, I hope you're having as much fun with this as I am. I love this kind of in-depth, nerdy story analysis discussion. That's really what this channel is all about. So if you enjoy it and you're having fun, then I think you found a home here, and I hope you'll decide to subscribe, stick around, maybe turn on notifications, and come be part of the Story Castle and hang out with us.
It would have been quite easy for Gaston's motive to be less clear, but again, the storytellers actually went to lengths to explore it a bit in the setup at the beginning of Act 1, and they do a good job of actually having him flat out state it, which may sound obvious, but a lot of these characters didn't do that. That makes her the best, and don't I deserve the best? Like, that's his motive. It's pure narcissism. I am the best, therefore I must have the best of everything according to how I see it and see the world. Now, is that compelling in the sense, it's certainly not sympathetic, but it is at least very understandable, and it creates story agency right away. He wants a thing, and thankfully, the thing that he wants is in direct opposition to the thing that the protagonist wants. She wants adventure in the Great Wide Somewhere. They set this up right away where either our protagonist, Belle, gets what she wants, or Gaston gets what he wants. They can't both have what they want. That is story conflict, and it prompts a whole series of things that happen after that. It's not exactly the inciting incident, because at some level, Beauty and the Beast is also primarily a romance, and romance has this odd function where the love interests are usually both protagonists and antagonists to each other in the story. It's one of the really interesting dynamics of romance as a genre, because they both represent a force of opposition to each other that require each other to grow and change, so that they can become the characters who deserve each other and can be together, which I think is one of the cool things about the romance genre. So there is sort of that dual dynamic where for a chunk of the movie, Beast is the antagonist, but I think it's actually correct to say that Gaston is the primary antagonist of the story, because he maintains that role throughout the story, and especially at the end, once Beast has sort of evolved as a character to the point where he no longer is an antagonist. We still need that in the story, and Gaston clearly is that all the way through. It's also worth naming that his power is really high, again, not because he has magic or he's a big, strong dude, but I think most of his power in the story comes from that recognizable thing of, like, he is the school bully. It's a social power. Everybody listens to him because he's big and handsome and charismatic, and he uses that power more so than almost anything else. Like, the main build up to the climax comes from him realizing that he can manipulate everybody to get what he wants. That is a very subtle but effective kind of power for the antagonist. He can manipulate, to get her father taken to the asylum and do all of these things because of essentially his social status as a power scale, which I think is really interesting. So I gave Gaston an 8 for motive, a 9 for power, a 7 for impact, but a 10 for style. I mean, any antagonist who gets an entire song built around how cool they are, it's hard to argue with that kind of style. And the bonus points for theme. Main theme of Beauty and the Beast is essentially that you must love others to both love yourself and be healthy and whole. And Gaston is the exact opposite of that. He only loves himself. He loves himself way too much. and therefore presents a strong sort of counter-argument or counter-dynamic to the central theme of learning to love others and essentially sacrifice or live on behalf of somebody else. So with the bonus points, that brings his total up to a very solid 39, and of course, where else could he go but full-on S-tier iconic Disney villain. Next, we have Jafar from Aladdin. Again, clear motive right from the beginning. He starts the story. He's looking for the lamp because he craves power, and he has a little bit of power, but not as much as he wants, and so he's going to get the lamp to become, an all-powerful what's it with all the wishes that he can gain. And he also has a different version. Gaston's sort of social power comes from his status. Jafar's sort of antagonist power comes from his manipulation. He puts on, one face, he, lives to serve, but actually he's got all these secret plans and he's doing all this stuff. He is a highly active antagonist all the way along in the story. They do a good job of finding ways to keep him active and keep making sure that he has impact on the story, even after it would have been easy for him to sort of recede into the background once Aladdin has the lamp, and then some of the questions in the story shift to being like, what's Aladdin going to do with that? They keep finding ways to bring Jafar back in, even after he gets, exposed, and, all the way through the story, he moves the story along by doing things that matter. So I gave Jafar a 6 for motive, a 7 for power, because even though he's a sorcerer, he has to kind of work from the shadows because technically the Sultan is more powerful than him, so that puts a little bit of a limit on some of his power until more towards the end of the story. But a 10 for impact and a 10 for style. I think he's extremely iconic and memorable in a lot of different ways. And also he gets the bonus points for theme as well. The core theme of Aladdin is basically what makes you great is what's inside, not what's outside. The diamond in the rough thing, and Jafar, again, is the opposite of that. He is great because of all the things on the outside. He's a powerful sorcerer. He's the vizier. He has a, position of power and whatever, and in his mind, that entitles him to things and makes him a great person, when we all are very clear that actually he's deeply flawed as a person on the inside. So he's sort of the opposite of Aladdin in that way, and the opposite of the theme, which gives him the bonus points, bringing him up to a 38, just a tick below Gaston. And finally, that brings us to Scar from The Lion King. Anytime you're going to base a movie on Shakespeare, in this case Hamlet, odds are good that your characters are going to be strong. And yes, Scar is incredibly strong, a very effective antagonist. Let's break down why. It certainly starts with motive. He's sort of the evil and more intense, less goofy version of Prince John's motive. And ironic that they're both lions. I'm not sure if that was intentional or not, but here we have it. Scar is highly jealous that Mufasa is the king and gets all the recognition, and that jealousy has sort of poisoned him and twisted his character, and so he comes up with this plan to overthrow the king, to murder him, and do all, take his place. Again, very, very clear motive that starts from a point of recognizable or even empathetic, in the sense that, oh yeah, I can empathize with why you feel that way, or the things that you feel that way about. Now, what you do about it, well, that's what makes you a bad guy. But it starts from a good place, as far as like the motive is strong and clear and makes sense to us. The power that he represents, in some ways, honestly, his power comes from his absolute confidence and self-assurance, which is especially important and effective because that's really Simba's biggest weakness. He starts out that way as a cub, but because of his experience, the thing he has to grow through as an adult character, is to regain that sense of knowing who he is and believing in himself and doing stuff instead of just shirking his responsibilities. Where Scar, all the way along, he knows exactly what he wants, and he doesn't hesitate for a second. He goes after it, and that sort of defines his power, and his willingness to do those bad things is a big part of what makes him so threatening as an antagonist character in the story. I think his biggest sort of weakness as a character is not necessarily his fault, but he's off screen for a good chunk of the story. Once he does his big, he kills his brother and he takes the throne, but Simba, goes into exile, then there's a big chunk of the movie in the middle where you don't even see him. He doesn't have anything to do. But once Simba comes back again to the Pride Lands, that picks back up again. So because he's active and critical as a character and the things he does matter so much to the story when he's doing them, I think it helps to off-balance the fact that there's a chunk of the story where he just isn't doing as much. So I gave Scar a 9 for motive, an 8 for power, a 10 for impact, and a 10 for style, bringing him up to a very solid 37. And yes, bonus points for theme. And the main theme of The Lion King is essentially some version of like power brings responsibility, not privilege. Like Mufasa's big lesson that he keeps trying to teach Simba as a child is like being king isn't about getting everything that you want. It's about taking responsibility for the land and the people and finding your place in the circle of life. And Scar is the exact opposite of that. In his mind, he should get what he wants, and he should have whatever he wants, because power means you get to do what you want, take what you want, etc. So, strong counter theme, bringing him up to our highest score so far at 42, which I think is a great spot for the king to be. Next, we have Governor Ratcliff from Pocahontas, where Scar is a good example of a somewhat nuanced villain that is charismatic and has things you even like about him, or there's some complexities there. Governor Ratcliff is a caricature, quite literally. He is a character with no clear backstory or motivation. You're meant to hate or despise him, dislike him. He doesn't really have any complex or redeeming qualities. He's just a jerk who is meant to be a jerk, and that's not great writing, not great storytelling. There's always room to nuance or complicate your characters, especially your antagonists, and that's not really done with him. He does get the bonus points for representing, the counter theme. The core theme of Pocahontas is like, learn to paint with all the colors of the wind. Like, learn to live in harmony with the world and other people. And he is the primary character who represents that counter thing of like, no, just take all the time. So yeah, he gets the bonus points for that. But for his overall score, I gave him a 4 for motive, a 6 for power, a 6 for impact, and a 4 for style, bringing him up to a 20. But the bonus points ooch him just in that line, and I would understand if you kept him, more in a C tier thing. But the fact that he presents the counter theme, I think, does enough to ooch him just to the very, very bottom threshold of B. Next is Frollo from Hunchback of Notre Dame. He is certainly one of the darkest and I guess most mature-coded antagonists because the story itself is that way, which makes sense because they're adapting an actual novel, not just a generic fairy tale. And that's probably part of the reason that The Hunchback of Notre Dame is a bit divisive, I think, in the Disney canon. Like, it's either one of people's favorite Disney movies that they really, really like, or one that people kind of skip over because in a lot of ways it doesn't really fit the normal Disney ethos and vibe. But not in a bad way, it's just different. And he is different also as a character. Certainly the only Disney villain whose motive is essentially lust, which is, again, a lot for a Disney story, but, there you have it. His motive's less effective as well because it isn't introduced from the beginning. The story starts quite slowly because Quasimodo, a little bit like Cinderella, doesn't really want anything necessarily until later, and Frollo also doesn't really want anything until he kind of meets Esmeralda, and then that sort of develops a little slowly until it really reaches that level of escalation as it builds throughout the story. It's not the worst, but it's not the best either. It's not like something like Scar, where it's like, man, the motive is clear from the beginning, and he starts taking action, and he incites the story, and all this stuff happens. It's sort of like background until it builds. He also gets the bonus points because the theme of The Hunchback of Notre Dame is almost exactly the same theme as Aladdin, where it's like, what makes you good is what's on the inside, not what's on the outside. And, Quasimodo is good even though he's deformed and judged, and, Frollo is bad even though he's respected. And, it's the same theme, but I'm not going to knock it for being the same theme because it is a theme and he is the opposite of it. So he gets those bonus points as well. So I gave Frollo a 5 for motive, a 9 for power, an 8 for impact, and an 8 for style. And with those bonus points, that brings him up to a 35. Right here. Man, you could almost argue 35 plus. I'm going to put him at the top of A. I don't think he's quite distinctive enough. It's not like you see a Frollo character walking around signing autographs at the Disney parks. He's a good, really strong antagonist for his story. I think it's valid to put him at the top of A instead of the bottom of S. Next, we have Hades from Hercules. Hades is another really good example, almost like Captain Hook, of how much of an impact style can have on a character. Specifically playing against type. Like the normal portrayal of Hades is usually as this very spooky or somber type character, and here he's this fast talking, almost like New York salesman kind of guy, and it's very funny and quick and witty and effective. His style is really, really strong. Motive wise, he has a really clear one. He has the Scar motive. My big brother is the king. I got shafted. I'm going to do something about it. So we've seen it before, but it works. One thing that's interesting too to me about Hades is his power is almost could potentially be too high. He is a god, and depending on how you define that in your story, that could mean that he's actually unbeatable. So they actually have to do things to kind of rein that in. Part of what does that is that he has to do the sort of he needs to keep his plans secret, so he can't go full out until the very end of the story. But yeah, his power is extremely high. It's just in some ways they have to almost work to keep it from being too overwhelming in the story, where he could just snap his fingers and do whatever he wants. Finally, I think it's worth naming that Hades is an interesting example of the antagonist. I don't think it's totally justified to give him the thematic bonus points. Not because the story of Hercules doesn't have a theme. It does. The theme is, the measure of a true hero is not his deeds, but his heart, right? Like, it's not what you do that makes you great. Again, it's that same, what's on the inside. But in this case, it's less about appearances and more about action. The thing that makes you a hero is how, that you'll lay down your life for somebody else, or some version of that, right? Versus all these big, impressive, flashy things you do on the outside. And that's great, that's fine, but Hades doesn't really represent a counter-argument to that theme. He doesn't really relate to the theme in a clear or specific way. So I don't really think it makes sense to give him the bonus points. But even still, I gave Hades an 8 for motive, a 9 for power, a 9 for impact, because he does drive the story along quite significantly, and a 9 for style, bringing him up to a very solid 35. I'll put him right there. I think if the thematic interconnection of his character into the theme of the story had been stronger, that would have probably been enough to move him up to the bottom of S tier, but top of A is still a great spot to be. Next we have Shan Yu from Mulan. He really doesn't have much motive to speak of, which you can immediately see why that right off the bat just makes for a weaker character. The Emperor built a wall, so he has to come fight, I guess, because it's quite weak and not well explored. He's certainly a threat. His hordes are dangerous. He's a great fighter, a great general, whatever. But he also suffers from some of that off-screen threat problem that Shere Khan and some of the other antagonists we've talked about have. He's sort of coming closer, but for a large part of the movie, he is not actively involved in much of anything other than he is invading. And in even the big battle where he kills Shen's father and takes out the main army, it happens off screen. We don't see it. We just find out about it later. We see the aftermath of it. And then they have he shows up in that one bit, and Mulan takes out his horde, and then he goes back to being this off-screen threat. The movie still works, but it works in spite of his shortcomings as an antagonist, not because of his strengths as an antagonist. So again, this is not about the movie, this is about this character, and I think the character has a lot to be desired, and there's more that could have been done to make him a better antagonist. So I gave him a 2 for motive, an 8 for power, a 6 for impact, and a 5 for style. He does not get bonus points because he's not clearly defined enough as a character to connect to the main theme of Mulan in any meaningful way. So that leaves him with a 21, just down in here towards the top of meh, but still in that C tier. Which brings us to Clayton from Tarzan. This was interesting because I had a minute. It's been a hot minute since I've seen the movie, and so as I started going through and thinking about his character and seeing a lot of the flaws in his character, or the shortcoming or weakness of him as an antagonist, I started thinking so why is the movie as good as it is? And then I remembered that he is not the only, or perhaps even the primary antagonist. One of the interesting aspects narratively of Tarzan is that Kerchak, the silverback gorilla that leads Tarzan's gorilla family, is in many respects more of an antagonist, or certainly for the first portion of the movie, he provides that antagonistic role. And he does it really well, and their relationship is really complicated and nuanced and meaningful. Clayton doesn't have a motive. He was just hired. He's on the ship, and they get there, and he's sort of like, I guess, a bodyguard. It's not until much later in the movie when he's like, well, I guess we'll just take a bunch of animals home to sell them. It's very poorly defined. He doesn't have a ton of power other than, like, he's a strong guy with a gun, and he doesn't do enough in the story. Again, because he doesn't have a motive, he doesn't have a reason to do very much until towards the end. I mean, he does set up the climax to an extent. A bit of a non-factor character, which is not really what you want from your antagonist. A bit of a budget Gaston, if you will. Like, in a lot of ways, he is meant to sort of be similar in function as a character, but it definitely does not do it nearly as well. So I gave him a 2 for motive, a 5 for power, a 7 for impact, and a 4 for style. If you really wanted to, you could maybe make an argument that he kind of represents the counter theme because he sort of represents, like, the bad version of being a man, like a human, a bad model for Tarzan, but I also don't feel like the theme itself is strong enough to really justify that, so I'm going to leave him right here at the top of D, which I think is valid. If you felt strongly about putting him in C, I wouldn't necessarily argue with you. Next, we have Yzma from The Emperor's New Groove. Kind of an outlier in this whole thing because The Emperor's New Groove as a movie is such a departure from classic Disney. I mean, I love it, but it is a full-on comedy, and it's a fourth wall-breaking kind of zany comedy to boot. So, but let's still talk about her as the antagonist of the story. One of the better motives that we've seen so far, ironically, or at least one of the more recognizable. Literally, she is miffed because her boss is a jerk, and she worked really hard for essentially this company, if you will. And then at the end, for whatever reasons, like, yeah, a little bit her fault, but broadly, the fact that Cusco is such a jerk means that towards the end of her career, she is fired, and she's upset about that and wants to kind of get revenge. And I think that's one of those things that we could all you look at that and you're like, if you've ever worked a job, you probably get it. And so, yeah, maybe what she does is a little too far, and that's what makes her an antagonist, but it certainly starts from a clear place, and then she's the inciting incident. Like, turning Cusco into a llama is the thing that gets the story really rolling along. Certainly, her style is extreme and super iconic. She's kind of like a way wackier version of Cruella de Vil, in a sense. Certainly fun, memorable. She is a comedic antagonist, but when you place a comedic antagonist in an explicit comedy, that is less of a problem than when you're kind of trying to split the difference in a story that isn't really a full comedy to begin with. So it works, I think, better in her case than it does in others. I gave Yzma a 9 for motive, an 8 for power, a 4 for impact, because she kind of does the same thing as Edgar, actually, from Aristocrats, where, like, once Cusco is out of the palace and out into the countryside, she's not as involved for a while, and then, yes, she's going out and chasing him, but the things that she does don't really directly relate to moving the story forward for a decent chunk of the middle of the story until that picks back up again when they reconnect. And then a 10 for style, because, come on, she's Yzma. Bringing us to a 31. Next we have Rourke from Atlantis. This is an interesting case because he's the first version of a trend that we will then see a lot of for the latter part of some of these Disney movies, which is what I just call the hidden antagonist, where a huge part of the point of the character is that you don't realize they're the antagonist. You, the audience, don't realize they're the antagonist until later on, usually towards the climax, and then it's revealed as a twist, which can be really cool, but also creates its own set of problems, because then it's very hard for a hidden antagonist to have much agency or effect on most of the story until you realize later on maybe that they were the one who did that thing, but you don't know it during the story. And Rourke is even less of that because it's not like he actually is trying to be the antagonist of the story. It's not like he has a plot from the beginning. He just, decides to be a mercenary, essentially. But the story of Atlantis, like the way it's set up, because it's more of a quest adventure narrative, it benefits from the fact that there's different ways you can also have the antagonist force represented. Like, for example, in a survival movie, you often don't have a primary character who is an antagonist. The threat is the big disaster. It's the volcano blowing up, or the end of the world, or the giant shark, or whatever. It's not so much a character as a force of nature. Can our protagonist or a cast of characters survive this thing? And that kind of happens in this case, the antagonist is the fact that Atlantis is this lost hidden thing. It's this really, really difficult journey or quest with lots of obstacles to be overcome. So it provides that same dynamic of there's opposition and something challenging to overcome, and Milo has to learn and grow as a character in his efforts to first reach Atlantis and then kind of learn about it and eventually try to save it from this disaster. And Rourke really doesn't play much of a role in that, but that's less of a problem in this type of story structure than it is in a different type of traditional storytelling where the antagonist role really matters a lot. So he's a little bit hard to rank, but I gave him a 2 for motive, a 5 for power, a 4 for impact, and a 5 for style. The twist reveal of him as the bad guy towards the end is interesting, and it does inject some tension into the climax, but overall, he doesn't add as much to the story purely from the function of the antagonist role overall. So with a 16, that plops him down here in our D tier as a character. Next, we have Gantu from Lilo and Stitch. I almost didn't even list him, but he is the closest thing to an antagonist in that story that you're going to find. Lilo and Stitch is a family drama. So a family drama is a subtype of romance as a broader genre in the sense that it's a story that is exploring the complexities and realities of love. And in this case, it's family love. It's the love between, really, Leilani, Lilo, and Stitch. And so they are each other's antagonists in different ways. And so you don't really need a traditional antagonist in that kind of story, but you do have him, so we're going to talk about him. He doesn't, like I said, he just doesn't do a lot. He's off screen for most of the story. His motive is pride. Stitch gets away from him at the beginning, and so he's a little more motivated than normal to go get him back. I don't know. He doesn't do a lot as a character. You could take Gantu out of the story, and most of it would really not change at all, which is a good indication that he, as a character, is not particularly well developed. So I gave him a 3 for motive, a 4 for power, a 4 for impact, and a 3 for style, bringing him down here at the bottom of our D tier with a 14. Next, we have Long John Silver from Treasure Planet. Silver is very interesting as a character from the original Treasure Island and in every adaptation of it, because it's very difficult to pull off this sort of frenemy antagonist. This idea of an antagonist who is actually important to or close to the protagonist, and the thing that eventually ultimately makes them be in opposition is the fact that for as much as they care about each other, their motivation is different and requires them, they can't both get what they want. And it often has this very tragic element to it. It can be extremely compelling when it's done well, which I think it is done well, certainly in this adaptation of Treasure Island, Treasure Planet. They lean into that really hard and really well. The relationship between Silver and Jim is developed really well. It matters, and by the end, it's you so want it to work. You want them to be able to be friends and go off and have adventures together, and it just can't happen because at the end of the day, they ultimately both have to be true to who they are, or at least they're true to what they've chosen and the path they've chosen, and that means that for as much as they care about each other, they can't coexist. That's very compelling story material. And so even though it's a little bit hard to nail down hyper clearly a strong central thematic message or argument in the story, it's kind of there. It's about, freedom and being true to yourself, and okay, it's not hyper well developed, but just because of the complex nature of the relationship between Silver and Jim, it does a lot of that same thing to elevate the story. So I'm going to give him the bonus points, which means that I have awarded him a 6 for motive, an 8 for power, an 8 for impact, and an 8 for style. And with the bonus points, that brings him up to a very respectable 35. Again, right in this top of A. I don't know that, again, it would be totally fair to put him all the way up into iconic, next to, Gaston and Scar and some of these characters. But he's certainly just, again, from a storytelling perspective, narratively, he is an excellent antagonist. Next, we have Dr. Facilier, the Shadow Man from Princess and the Frog. Suffers a bit from a lack of a super clear motive. We know what he's trying to do. We're less clear why he's trying to do it. And if they had developed that a little bit better and given us a more compelling why behind his efforts to mess around with Naveen and get money and stuff. Like, it's sort of like, okay, but why? So that's not ideal. Certainly his power is quite high. Like, he does all these things, and his sort of voodoo magic, he's got friends from the other side. Like, that is good, and it means that gives him a lot to work with and a lot of threat that the characters have to deal with, and lots of obstacles that come from him as a character, and certainly a high impact on the story. So overall, he's actually a really good antagonist. He just stumbles a bit from a lack of a particularly clear motive. He does a very good job presenting the counter theme. The thematic aspect of Princess and the Frog, to me, is actually really interesting because it's not one we've really seen before. It's essentially like, it's great to have a dream, but you have to work hard and keep show up for your dream and work hard to achieve it, versus like, if you just wish upon a star, it'll happen. It's sort of the anti-Cinderella in a lot of ways. And I like that. And then he does a great job of representing the counter theme. He's sort of the seductive promise of power. Here's this shortcut. If you're willing to, hurt other people to get what you want, and use power to get what you want, you can get this shortcut, and you don't have to work hard, and you don't have to struggle, and you don't have to wonder whether you can just have what you want. He's that sort of seductive whispering, and right in that climax, he's like, hey, just give up on this guy, like, let me have what I want, and I'll give you what you want, and everybody wins. So that's actually really good, and he gets the bonus points for that. So overall, I gave him a 2 for motive, a 9 for power, an 8 for impact, a 7 for style, and with those bonus points from the theme, that gives him a very respectable 31, bopping him in here into our great tier. All right, we're getting down towards the end, moving into more modern Disney, with Mother Gothel from Tangled. Very clear motive. In essence, she's kind of like the final form of the original Wicked Queen. It's vanity, but it's vanity that is more clearly explored and defined. She's desperate to be young forever, and once she realizes that Rapunzel is the only way for her to have access to that power, she develops this very interesting, they explore these codependent relationship and sort of that narcissism of a person who puts on a mask of caring for someone just in order to manipulate them. It's really quite subtle, and they could easily have not done that, not spent the time to develop the complexity of that kind of Stockholm Syndrome relationship that she and Rapunzel have, but they do, and it's a big part of what makes the story better than if she had just been more of a caricature or a cutout type character. She also has some of that same element of the Wicked Stepmother, where a lot of her power comes from what Rapunzel lets her do, but because Rapunzel has this really clear motive from the beginning, unlike Cinderella, there's more opposition there, and her efforts to keep the status quo, it's clearer what the stakes are, at least for Rapunzel's own life as a character. So it's like a lot of the same things that we saw way back at the beginning, but refined and nuanced and done better and more effectively. She also gets the bonus points for the theme, that one of the main, the driving themes in the story that is a central feature of Rapunzel and Flynn's love story arc, is that if you really love something, you need to do what's best for that thing or that person, not what's best for you, even if it costs you something. And in the climax, Flynn and Rapunzel are both trying so hard to give up in either their life at one level or another on behalf of the person that they love, where Gothel is quite the opposite. She is determined to take someone's life, essentially, to get what she needs. So that creates that strong sort of thematic conflict. So I gave her a 9 for motive, a 7 for power, a 4 for impact, because she is, unfortunately, off-screen for a lot of the story, but an 8 for style, and with the thematic bonus points, that brings her up to a very respectable 33. Kind of here in the middle of A. Next, we have King Candy, who is a much more explicit example of that thing we talked about with Rourke of the hidden antagonist. For a large portion of the story, you don't know that he's the antagonist. You don't know that he's the one that did the things that set the story problem up in the first place. You find it out as a twist later. So he's kind of just a secondary character for a large portion of the story until that twist reveal that he is Turbo. And then all at the end, you're like, oh, that's his motive. That's what he did. That's his stuff. So again, that is a storytelling approach that can definitely work, but you'll notice that it works best in stories that find a strong way to still bring the antagonistic aspect into the story to create tension and conflict. If he was the only thing that was doing that, it would not work well. But because it is a friend love story, and so the conflict between Ralph and Vanellope as each other's antagonists, that's a strong dynamic at a character level that is pushing them both to have moments of realization, growth, and change. And then also you've got the cybugs. If they didn't have the cybugs as the external threat that's looming and building and growing, then the fact that King Candy is hidden for so long would be a real problem. But because both of those elements take place, it provides a strong structure while he is hidden, so that then when the twist comes in, it's like, ooh, that's cool. But it doesn't matter that we don't see him until much later in the story. However, if I'm only talking about him as a character, then we've got to sort of account for the fact that he's much more interesting on a second viewing of the movie than he is on the first viewing of the movie, which makes him very hard to rank. But I'm going to do my best by giving him an 8 for motive. Once you find out that his motive was that he resents being passed over and overlooked, and he's trying to do what he can to kind of maintain a life for himself, which again starts at that place of, that's a recognizable motive at the very least. An 8 for power, a 4 for impact, and a 5 for style. He doesn't really engage the counter theme. Well, hang on a minute. Does he? I guess the main theme of Wreck-It Ralph is that it centers all around that idea of being the bad guy. And like Ralph is typecast as the villain, but he wants to be a hero and he becomes one. King Candy is sort of, I don't think it's strong enough of an association to give the bonus points. It is a bit interesting that it's sort of that same thing of like on the outside he's this, good respected character, but really he's like a secret villain. I don't know that it's done clearly enough or well enough for the bonus points. So without that, he gets a 25, which is just enough, I think, to put him in this B tier. Yeah, that seems good. Yeah, totally valid. He is good enough. Next we have Hans and, wait a minute, Elsa. What is this? What is this madness? Elsa's the hero. What are you talking about? Hans is the villain. Okay, this one is really interesting. Let's break this down. I would argue that Frozen is the most narratively complex and narratively compelling story Disney has ever made. There's a whole video that I hope to do about that at some point soon. It's very difficult to tell a story with dual protagonists who really truly each are a clear protagonist and have a clear arc from beginning to end that both resolve satisfactorily in the climax. That is incredibly hard to do, and they do it very well with Anna and Elsa both. Because it is essentially a love story, as I've talked about before, Elsa is Anna's antagonist. And I think even though they both have a protagonist arc, if you really, really boil it down, Elsa provides most of the antagonistic force of the story. Hans is a hidden antagonist. Like, you don't realize he's kind of a bad guy until right at the very end with that twist. He's kind of doing that King Candy thing where it's hidden until you get the twist payoff. But unlike King Candy, he is not involved in the story in any meaningful way. He didn't really do anything back in the past that then when you get the twist, it's like, oh my gosh, he's the reason that happened. He just turns out to be a jerk. You could remove Hans from the story, and aside from that fun little twist where Disney is kind of doing the wink-wink towards its own past with the thing of like what we assume true love has to mean, and then they're like, nope, gotcha, it's actually about the true love between these sisters. Like, okay, good enough. But Hans as a character is somewhat irrelevant. I mean, he's needed because of some of what he does for Anna and her storyline, but he could have been a secondary character, just like he could have also just kind of been the boyfriend that didn't work out. He didn't really need to be an antagonist because Elsa is phenomenal as an antagonist. So let me look at both of their scores together to see kind of how they break down. So for Hans, I did give him an 8 for motive because at least they are clear what his motive is. He came here because I guess he has no prospects back home because he's got a big family and he's got to strike out on his own. And it's kind of like he could almost be if he was a different type of person, that would be the start of a different story where he's the protagonist. But in this case, yeah, that makes for a good motive, or at least a clear one. But I gave him a 2 for power, he has almost none in the story, a 1 for impact, he has almost none in the story, and a 3 for style, he is very generic, which gives him a 14, total score. As an antagonist, if he was the bad guy, the actual antagonist of the story, it would be a huge gaping hole in the story. But because Elsa has such a compelling antagonist/protagonist character arc, this is the whole point of the story. So I gave Elsa a 9 for motive. She wants to be who she is, but she's afraid that if she is who she is, she'll hurt everyone around her, and she does to a degree, or at least parts along the way, so she has to discover, her motive is very clear and strong. A 9 for power. She is the Ice Queen. The things she does and her ability to act on her choices drives the story forward, and therefore a 9 for impact, and a 10 for style. Good gracious, the amount of merch that this character has spawned, and how iconic she is, and how much so many kids and people have sort of recognized her and bonded to her. And yeah, whenever you have a character that is the Halloween theme of the year, you've hit the style nail on the head, which gives her a total of 37, and then with the counter theme, she literally states the theme multiple times. Conceal, don't feel. She has this power, and her response to it, instead of learning to be who she is well, she feels like she must hide who she is, and that creates mounting problems until she finally realizes that she has to that love is the antidote to fear. It just works. It's super, super good. And so with the bonus points, that gives her a 42, tying her with Scar for, I think, one of the most effective antagonist characters. Certainly not one that I think many people, because again, she's not a villain, but she is the antagonist. And I think that's a very interesting and nuanced aspect to that story. That's one of the reasons why it worked so well and was so popular. Coming down the home stretch, we have Professor Callahan, aka Yokai from Big Hero 6, has some of the same challenges of a hidden antagonist as King Candy or Hans, where he's just sort of his villain. It's like I almost have to rate him as two different characters. The Professor Callahan character that is revealed right at the end of the movie is much more interesting as an antagonist, but we don't know that until the very, very end, because most of what we see is just this very kind of generic, faceless, looming villain. Once you find out his motive and stuff, it's more interesting. So it's very challenging to rate, because if, as a yokai, I think he's a bit bland and uninteresting as a superhero villain. But as Professor Callahan, whose motive is to get revenge on the CEO of the company because his daughter was killed because he had no ethics and whatever, very interesting. And he actually has a really strong relationship with Hero. The central theme of this movie is actually all around grief, dealing with grief and loss, which makes it, I think, interesting and different, certainly from the larger Disney canon. And you find out, again, at the end, that he does relate strongly to that, because he sort of represents the dark turn of what grief can do to you if you let it fester and you don't handle it in a good way. But you don't get that until the end. So very complicated to rate. I went ahead and gave him an 8 for motive. Once you find out what it is, it's good enough that I think the wait is worth it, and there's a strong payoff there, even though you don't know what his yokai villain persona's motive is ever. They don't know what his motive is. He's just doing bad villain stuff, and they kind of have to stop him, but they're not sure why he's doing it. I gave him an 8 for power, a 6 for impact, and a 2 for style, which gives him a total of 24, but with the bonus points, that bumps him up to 29. Which is enough to get him towards the top of B tier, which I think is a totally valid place for him. Next, we have Bellwether from Zootopia, another hidden antagonist. Man, it's once they got this idea, they just ran with it for a while. You don't find out she's the villain until the very end. It's all the stuff we've talked about before. She does it better, I think, than any of the characters who have come before, partly because it's a mystery. It's primarily a mystery genre. And that is a kind of normal thing in the mystery genre or a thriller genre. It's very normal that you don't know who done it. And the whole point is you're trying to find out who done it. And so the challenge of the fact that you don't know who done it and the detectives are trying to find a series of clues totally fills in for the fact that you know there's an antagonist who is doing something, and that you see the effect of their actions. You just don't know who they are or their motive. But within that genre, we expect that. And so that works a lot better in her case. And then the twist of her motive is that by then they've done a really good job of establishing that this whole you have prey animals and predator animals, and it's a little bit almost that Hunchback of Notre Dame thing of you're treated a certain way because of factors outside of your control, and she gets sick of it. She's smarter and more capable than her boss and all of the other predator animals who are all kind of jerks, and so she decides she's going to do something about it. And it's a good clear motive again once you find out what it is. So I think as a good example of the hidden off-screen antagonist that's the twist reveal at the end, I gave her a 9 for motive, a 4 for power, a 5 for impact, and a 5 for style, which brings her to a 23, but I do think she deserves the bonus points. The core theme of Zootopia is actually kind of a little bit like Princess and the Frog, where it doesn't matter how other people see you. If you have a dream, you work hard and you go after it, and you don't let your limitations stop you. And so she's kind of like the dark or opposed version of that same track that Judy is going on, which I think sets up a good contrast. So with the bonus points, that gives her a 29 and drops her here next to this other kind of hidden antagonist that we had to deal with. Next, we have another interesting combination of antagonist characters from the same movie, which is Moana, that being Te Kā and Maui. And again, like, what are you talking about? Maui is not the antagonist. Yes, he is. He is the primary antagonist in what is, again, essentially a romance, even though, again, it's not all romance broadly as a genre is about romantic love. It's just about love. And in this case, it's almost like a sibling, brother-sister relationship that they end up developing, but also like a mentor-mentoree relationship. It's really good, really interesting, really complex. And if Te Kā was the only antagonist of the story, it would be much, much weaker, because Te Kā is this threat that is tied to this island that until they get there doesn't matter, and they can leave and come back as many times as they want to. She's threatening in the sense that she is, giant lava monster, but no very particularly clear motive. She wants the heart for reasons that are never really... I mean, there's a little bit of that hidden antagonist thing. The twist reveal right at the very end, I mean, I guess spoilers, but that she is Te Fiti. Okay, cool, that's neat. But again, if this was the only thing we had going as an antagonistic force in the story, it would be much weaker. But we have Maui. Maui is the antagonist of the story because he is the character who most directly opposes Moana's goals, which are to restore the heart and save her island. And in order to do that, she needs Maui to grow up and take responsibility for his actions and become the hero that he keeps trying to be through short-sighted and immature means. And so the tension or the conflict between they cannot both get what they want. Maui wants the shortcut, the short path to love and respect and adoration and to feel like he belongs, but he's afraid of or hides from dangerous, costly, or challenging things because deep down he's afraid. And Moana needs to help him grow past that, and eventually does help him grow past that to become all of that he is meant to be as a character. So they are each other's antagonists, but because Moana is clearly the protagonist of the story, he is the primary antagonistic force in the story, kind of like Elsa was with Hans, where you wouldn't probably hear him listed if other people were talking about like who are great Disney villains. He's certainly not a villain, and he doesn't fit that same mold, but he does a really, really great job of providing most of the force of opposition or antagonism in the story, which is a huge part of what makes it such a well-told story. So I gave Te Kā a 2 for motive, barely has one, an 8 for power, a 1 for impact, and a 6 for style, a total of 17. But Maui gets a 9 for motive, an 8 for power, a 9 for impact, and a 9 for style, giving him a 35. And then I think it's totally valid to give him the 5 bonus points because the whole core theme, especially in Moana's journey, is finding your place. Like, what does it mean to really find your place? And for her, it's that tension between taking her place in the expectations of her family and her tribe and whatever, like growing up in that way versus being true to who she is. And Maui, for most of the story, represents the counter theme of like, it's all about ego and selfishness, but eventually he also finds how to become who he is and take his place. And he relates clearly enough to that theme that I think the bonus points are warranted, bumping him up to a very strong 40. Next, we have the Droon and Namaari from Raya and the Last Dragon. The Droon is not really a character, so you can't really rate it. They never give it a clear motive or backstory. I kind of wish they had. I always thought it would have been stronger if they had committed by actually saying at least where it came from or why it was happening in some way. But it's basically the apocalypse. It's big, scary, world-ending threat. survival story, disaster movie level threat. Which, again, can totally work as a force of antagonism, even if it's not a character with motive and agency. But you'll notice, again, because they do that, if the Droon was the only thing, and especially because it's sort of, for a good part of the story, it's this off-screen threat. It's a looming, it could come at any time, but it's not like in every scene by any means. So we need Namaari, and she is great. Namaari is a great character. She has that frenemy thing very strongly, the same thing as Long John Silver with Jim Hawkins. She has that with Raya. Literally, that's one of the big dynamics of their relationship. They are princesses who understand each other, could be friends, want to be friends. They share interests, and they're the competing needs of their people and their motivation drive them apart and make it very difficult or impossible. And it's like a tragic, painful relationship for both of them. That's great story material. So I'm going to put the Droon in B tier. It's good enough. It does its job. It is neither more nor less compelling that it needs to be this kind of big, the threat that needs to be solved. But let's talk about Namaari's ranking as a character. I gave her a 9 for motive. She's a very clear, she wants to do what she feels she has to do for her people. She's a Disney princess to a large degree. Her motive is clear and understandable. I gave her a 6 for power, a 6 for impact because she's kind of chasing Raya for most of the story, but she's not hugely involved directly in the plot elements until towards the end. And then an 8 for style, which I guess you could argue with. I think her style is distinctive and works and does a strong job of setting her apart from Raya and helping her stand out and giving her that kind of badass edge without making her overtly villainous, leading to a total score of 29. And then core theme of Raya basically centers around that we have to learn to trust each other and do what's best for everyone, not just what's best for us or our people. And she is the counter argument to that. That's what Raya ultimately has to learn, and kind of what Namaari also has to learn. But for most of the movie, she is I am out for Fang and Fang alone, and I'll do what I have to do for my people, even if it comes at the cost of everybody else. And that is sort of the counter argument to what the core theme or thematic argument of the story is. So she gets those bonus points, which moves her up to a nice solid 34. And finally, we have Abuela Alma from Encanto, another character that I think most people would not necessarily identify as an antagonist. She's certainly not a villain, but man, yes, she very much is the antagonist of Encanto. Encanto is a family drama, primarily, so, the complexities of family love and the dynamics between them are kind of like Lilo and Stitch, but thankfully they don't arbitrarily crowbar in an external threat. I think the movie would have been weakened by that distraction. She is the antagonist because she most directly opposes what Mirabel wants. Mirabel wants to feel like she belongs in her family, even though she's not like them. And Abuela Alma is the character that most consistently makes that hard or impossible because she can't let go of her fixation on this idea that the miracle is the thing that makes their family special, rather than coming to see, which she eventually does at the very, very end, that actually what makes you special is who you are, not what you can do. I mean, that's the thematic payoff of the story. She is a fantastic character. She is a fantastic antagonist. She's extremely nuanced and complex, and very, very different than many of these characters because she's not a bad guy. She's not a villain, but a really good example of how the antagonist role has such a huge impact on the story if it's handled well. So I gave her a 10 for motive. I think it's one of the best and clearest antagonist motives from this entire list. A 6 for power, an 8 for impact, and a 7 for style, giving her a total of 31, and with the thematic bonus points, a 36, putting her right up here with some of the great antagonistic characters of Disney movies.
And there we have it! One very comprehensive tier list of every major Disney antagonist up to Encanto. I have not actually seen the more recent Disney movies like Strange World that have come out, so I didn't want to include them, but if you have, please drop a comment and let me know how you would rank the antagonists from those films, and I would be curious to see where you would put them on the list. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was fun for you. I hope you learned a few things about storytelling and especially the role that an antagonist character can play in a great story, and I will see you in the next one.